Evelina. Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in.
So welcome to our Research Insights with Elite Mind Academy, and we are actually rebranding our podcast into Human Needs at Work. So you will be seeing a shift in our topics slowly, as you've already, I think, observed that from the last few topics, where we're really looking at variety of unmet human needs and how that then translate into variety of difficulties and problems at organizational level. So we really believe that the way we live and the way we work in our modern society is, because it's so far away from how we have evolved to thrive and to survive through millions of years. It results in creating a lot of issues in our society, in our health, in equality, in the way we communicate, in the way we treat each other. And today's topic is one of those topics that are always at the top of agenda, and companies really want to do something about it. And that is a gender pay gap. And we really want to look at that topic from the perspective of what are these human needs behind this problem and what organizations can do to address that.
Absolutely. So we're going to kind of delve into the problem itself, what the dynamics and the human needs are there, and how that then kind of participates in or as part of the organizational dynamics and needs too. And then we're going to have a look at some solutions. So how can we actually address the gender pay gap in a substantial way, not a superficial way where, often initiatives can end up being kind of not targeting the real cause of the problem. So we'll look at that kind of from the perspective, those solutions from the perspective of individuals, but also businesses, organizations as well.
Yeah. And a lot of our research and statistics that we will be sharing today are from the research of Claudia Goldin. So as you know, this is an American economist who won a Nobel Prize recently for her amazing work in highlighting inequalities in gender and all of the economic behavioral science behind that pay gap that we are seeing. So what are some of those biggest trends that we're observing? That actually the pay gap is not actually distributed equally across society. It's not distributed equally across different ages of women. It's also not distributed equally when we start comparing education of different people as well. So there is a lot of different nuances there that feed into that. And women who have highest education and end up having children are the ones that are bearing the biggest unfair injustice in terms of their pay gap in comparison to men who would be of equal educational status.
Absolutely. And, part of that is about the actual practical implications of motherhood and what that does to family dynamics, household dynamics in terms of the division of labor, but also working practices. But there's also the impact of from the business, this perception that women will have children, or that women with children will have a kind of lower attention or priority level for their work. And that can then impact pay rises, promotions, and things like that. So there's this kind of dual element to it, whereby it's the actual practical implications of motherhood and the emotional implications as well on the individual, but also it's the perception of motherhood from the business.
Yeah, so as you've already touching on that, when we look at this kind of distribution of it, motherhood is the biggest factor in that inequality. So when we look at women who don't have children, then that gender pay gap doesn't really exist for them in a way, and women can have equal opportunities and equal pay, and the gap starts widening from the moment that you have children, and actually even from the time when women gets married. So even for those families who do not have children, marriage in itself is one of these contributing factors that then feed into that inequality and pay gap, which shows a lot of other kind of underlining causes and kind of inequality and maybe unequal division of labor between that couple, right, in that household. So we kind of like making assumption of the typical male and female relationship, but again we have all of these different dynamics that play out differently, and there is a lot that we still need to do to look into how we can make that reality fairer within our household unit first, so that it then translates into the society.
Certainly. And kind of when we look at that as well through this gaze of, okay, what is practical, tangible impact, and also what's perceived impact, we can notice that, yes, so there's this there's a sort of cultural assumption often in heterosexual relationships that the man will be a higher breadwinner, will earn more, and the woman will take on more of the household labor. And even in circumstances, there's evidence to show that even in circumstances where individuals themselves believe, they don't want that to be the case, because of kind of deeply embedded cultural practices and beliefs, it often can end up being the case anyway. And so that then influences sometimes a woman's confidence in asserting that she may want to prioritize her career, and also in asking a man to take on more of the household responsibilities so that she can pursue career goals. That can reduce the woman's confidence in asking for that, but also the man's kind of willingness to do so, because there's a potential compromise of masculinity there. And then when we kind of look at that from the business perspective and also kind of perceptions, as soon as a woman gets married, in the eyes of businesses, the kind of time bomb, or time bomb isn't it the right word, but
Yeah.
the clock begins thinking, okay, so they're going to have children soon. And so we won't give them promotions, we won't give them pay rises, we kind of won't invest in these married women, because we perceive that they will soon be a cost to us.
Yeah. And again, sometimes this is not, as explicit, as obvious as Valentina said. A lot of these beliefs are embedded in our kind of subconscious cultural belief system, right? So, we think we are equal. We think we are treating everybody the same, but there are these all subconscious limitations. And of course, sometimes it is explicit things, and you are being asked in job interviews, are you planning to have kids, and all of these kind of, discriminatory practices that absolutely exist. But I think nowadays, this whole, when we talk about inclusion and diversity and equality, both from gender and different perspective of equality, a lot of that is due to some of these kind of systemic, it's being embedded in our systems and how we work and in how our society operates, rather than being intentional act of discrediting someone or really kind of doing that intentionally, creating that inequality.
Absolutely. And so that's, kind of another, as if we needed more, but another reason to really attend to your unconscious bias. This is how these are the real life implications of that. We can have these very conscious and really we can really commit to values and beliefs that we have on a conscious level. But if we don't address those unconscious dynamics and accept that we will be influenced by our culture and the environments we've grown up in, we need to accept that we will be operating with unconscious bias. And regardless of what our value system is on a conscious level, we also have to accept that there will be conflicting unconscious bias there. And until we learn to accept that, make space for it, listen to it, and respond to it in a productive and constructive way, then we're going to keep perpetuating these inequalities.
Yeah, and having a plan for dealing with our own biases and creating some of these equal opportunities. So, like I mentioned, it's those with the highest education level that end up having the highest pay gap. So, for example, the average college educated man improves his earnings by 77% from the age of 25 to 45, while similarly for women, those earnings in between that same age increases only by 31%. And when we look at the trend, it starts at equal place. So when you finish your college, your university, whatever that education level is, when we're comparing people with the same status and the same level of qualification and education, they start with the same opportunities and the same chances. And it kind of goes quite equally up to the point then when you end up being married, and then affects that inequality even more once you have children. So absolutely, there is also, even, and again, it kind of takes, even for women who don't have children, it still takes longer actually to increase their salaries in a long run, because at some point it kind of, that gap starts widening. Like you say, Valentina, like sometimes for some of these kind of expectations and judgments that you are of that age where you're supposed to be having children and so on, and therefore some of those opportunities are not being created for women. So of course it results in the fact that only 5% of executives are women, and when we look at the top earners, only quarter of them are women. I believe those are US statistics based on Claudia Goldin's research. And again, of course, there are variations across the countries, but US is quite a good large-scale standard to showcase more of a kind of like a Western culture and Western statistics, really overall as a benchmark.
Absolutely. And I think this is kind of a useful point as well. Please do let us know in the chat what your experience is of the gender pay gap. So there's a lot of research that's been done into this, and we're looking into it, but we'd also really love to hear your experiences from what you may have witnessed or perceived, but also what you've experienced yourself. But also, if you're in a position of, say, a hiring manager or in an exec position, how does gender influence your decision-making process, if you don't mind sharing?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have worked with some amazing executives, both male and female, who are doing great work in promoting equality and creating opportunities. And I think the biggest impact that we all can make on someone's life is really giving a chance and giving opportunity for someone, and sometimes recognizing someone's potential before they even realize themselves. I think while we look at this kind of unequal division of labor and kind of the impact of maternity on the gender pay gap, what we also need to realize that there is a huge shift for women themselves that need to happen in our own mindset and in how we accept our own role in society, right? And I think even for me personally, the fact that I run the business, the fact that I have I have a team, and I've decided to have this to have purpose of my life fulfilled through my work, which is, again, it's really rewarding, but that also means that I end up working a lot of hours. That also means that I never feel good enough as a wife and as a mother, right? Because if I'm comparing to other role models of motherhood, which is, in this case, let's say it is my mom, right? My mom sacrificed her hopes, lives, dreams, visions, goals for the sake of supporting her husband's business and for raising the children. So she stayed at home to raise me and my brother, and of course we had wonderful childhood, and custom built games and education, and all of this stuff that she really created for us. But that means that is now also my role model of good motherhood and good wife, right? Which somehow becomes incompatible with my way of living and working, and trying to make an impact through my work and career, and wanting to live on purpose, right? And to achieve my full potential, rather than really kind of shrinking down and just sacrificing my life for others, right? So I think we really have to take that in consideration, that this is not just equal opportunities and kind of these external factors, right? There is a lot of internal baggage that we have as women ourselves, what good motherhood and what good wife look like, that we allow those behaviors and this kind of unequal division of labor to just simply exist, because that kind of feeds our self-worth and self-esteem from the perspective, right? And in
Certainly.
and in the same way, other way around, from men's perspective, it's the same. We put this expectation that men have to be powerful breadwinner, and so on, and any kind of different reality can threaten that social ideal and this kind of status that we create from that perspective.
Absolutely. And, this kind of prompting this again, a lot of this is about real internal reflection and conscious choices in terms of how we manage our human needs. When we have these needs for a sense of self-worth and fulfillment, we should be looking at, or it could be beneficial to look at, who are those role models for us, and what do we want to take from that, and what do we want to leave behind to make space for how we choose to operate in the world and our lives. And this, I think you kind of highlighted really well there, Evelina, this you can have it all perspective that is kind of came out of sort of first wave feminism, and actually really second wave feminism, is that you can be a mother, you can be beautiful, and you can also be a high achieving career woman. You can have it all.
Exactly.
Something has got to give there. We can't do everything. We can't be in multiple places at once. And I think we as women, but also kind of as a society, need to allow some slack there and release all of these standards from our sense of identity. As if we aren't ticking all of these boxes, doing it all, we can feel this sense of failure, because we've been told that we can do it all. So if we're not, that's a personal failure. And I think it's kind of useful to sort of look at how that's represented in society as well. So you mentioned earlier that educated women, so women with university educations and even postgraduate educations, are kind of suffer the most, and especially those who have children as well, or even those who are married and don't have children. And part of that is to do with, kind of professionally educated women and men, or anyone, are more likely to get into roles that have long, inflexible working hours. So the kind of having university degrees, and particularly in things like finance, law, kind of those professional services, immediately the roles that are available to you then become those that really valorize and have a culture around long, inflexible working hours, which is of course extremely incompatible with balancing household duties.
And the same things as well when you look at careers in STEM, right? You look at all of these other fields that are traditionally seen as very kind of like male dominated, right? You look at economics, right? So Claudia Goldin, she's an amazing example of really role modeling that female research and paving the way for other women to do the same. And when we look in academia and research, technology, innovation, a lot of kind of medical science, a lot of those fields are still have ways of working that are not fit to provide for the needs of women who are, first of all, even in relationship, right? And then the most importantly, who have children. So there's so many things as well, and some of these kind of assumptions that we have that, and you see sometimes, some of this kind of company culture and kind of gossip where, if women leaves work earlier, leaves office earlier because she says, I need to go and pick up my child from school, or I'm attending sports day for the child, there is this attitude often being looked at as like, oh, she's slacking off again, right? Because women supposed to be doing it all without reducing something else, right? It's like, that childcare is just your responsibility, and that should not affect your work and your input. While if men decides to leave work early and says, oh, I'm attending my son's sports day, we look at him as like, yeah, he's such a good father, isn't he, right? So it's a lot of these attitudes are really from the society of how we perceive this kind of balance of work in our careers, but also recognizing that working in personal capacity, childcare, homework, that is still work. And a lot of women don't have time for themselves and for their own, activities, because you have one job and then you come back to another job that requires a lot of burden of responsibility for, working for your children, working for your house, and so on. So definitely there has to be this shift in perspective about how do we see maternity in itself as work and as a task that adds value to family, to society, to humanity in general, right? And that has to be valued and not be somehow diminished as if it's always just something there that you do and you still have to contribute equally. It has to come at the balance of, if I want to do this well and if I want to be a good mother, I need those conditions, flexibility, and something else has to give.
Certainly, and I think this is an important point to highlight, this, again, dual responsibility. So there's a responsibility there from individuals to really look at their own priorities and have a level of self-acceptance about where that something has to give, and also the value of the household and family labor versus the value of paid working labor. But also there's a responsibility there from organizations to incorporate this understanding of basic human needs into their organizational structure to try and account for it so that it doesn't perpetuate this pay gap. There's kind of research has shown that with this kind of working structure whereby better educated people are drawn towards these roles with kind of round the clock availability, where you'd be working long hours and you're often on call when you're actually not even working, or it's kind of not within your contracted hours. That disproportionately affects women. Having those kinds of working practices disproportionately affects women, because often we are still in a society where often the mother takes on the greatest burden of childcare. And if someone is on call at work, there also has to be someone on call at home. And that often isn't acknowledged, kind of the impact of that. That's seen as, this is your private life. This is, not something that should be considered in working practices. But actually, it does need to be considered in working practices if we're going to get the best out of employees, but also if we're going to contribute effectively to the society that we want to create and see.
Absolutely. So when we're looking at those, top prestigious career jobs that are best paid, we really need to re-engineer them from the perspective of making those jobs possible for women in the first place, right? Because they are just simply not designed with that in mind. And of course, there is this kind of legacy from all of these kind of industrial revolution years and so on, where it was, the workplaces were created for men by men, and we really have to redesign our workplaces with more flexibility and different human needs in mind.
Absolutely. And kind of when we think about ways that that organizations can support with this, there's obviously, as we mentioned, addressing those unconscious bias. So kind of looking at, like you said, Evelina, how the organization has been constructed, whose needs have been at the forefront of the mind when constructing those organizational practices. So there's that looking, kind of taking an internal reflection there, and also taking a reflective approach on how the organization has been constructed and working practices. And then there's the kind of practical changes here. So what does that then lead to? So if we want to kind of enable that equality and enable, say, a more equal division of labor at home, we also have to allow for people in those kinds of high earning professional roles to have more flexibility, to have shorter working hours, and actually kind of balance that so that both men and women, and obviously we're talking a lot in a gender binary here because we're looking specifically at how the gender pay gap is affecting men and women, but kind of really looking at how do we create circumstances where a man could work more flexible, shorter hours, and take up some of the responsibilities at home, and a woman could do the same and not kind of neither of them sacrifice promotions and pay rise.
That's right. I think you're highlighting here very, very important point, because when we think about gender pay gap, there is this huge kind of misconception that there are things that we need to do for women, right? Like we need to give them more flexible hours, we need to create more opportunities for them, where actually men have a huge role to play in this. And we need to enable men to be able to support women at home better. And that means that we need to create the same, paternity pay rights. We need to create the same flexible working hours for them to be able to have that equal share of labor at home. We need to be able to create those opportunities where your working hours does not have negative consequences on your family life and on your on your personal life in general, right? So even when we look now, I think there's this huge recognition that the way we work, especially this kind of like top executive careers, they're so inflexible, they're so demanding. It really takes a lot out of us to perform at that level. And there is very little space for maneuver. There's very little flexibility. And as we've shared some of the statistics before about the fact that 75% of executives would choose to leave their jobs for the role that better supports their health and well-being. And this is the largest number ever, that we are now suddenly waking up to this realization that, what, this career, this job, this financial stability that I've created, it comes at the cost. And now we are recognizing the need and shifting our priorities to more of a life rather than just living to work and just to earn. So I think definitely that's the biggest thing that we can do, is to really create those flexible ways of working so it can spread out to both men and women, and especially looking at those best paid opportunities. How can we create them more flexible, and how can we share that burden of division of labor at home in a way that, it has to be facilitated through these flexible ways of working.
Absolutely. And I think something that's really important to highlight here as well is that those people who take up flexible working and take up shorter hours do not suffer in terms of pay. And that's really where an organization might feel a sense of resistance, because there is this culture of, you feel like you're getting more from people if you have more of their attention and availability. But we can actually really shift our practices so that you don't lose out on productivity and you don't lose out on earnings, if we enable more job shares. And actually things, where there's clients, say, might be expecting this round the clock on call availability, you don't necessarily have to say that that's impossible and put that boundary there for the client, but actually change your internal working practices whereby there's really useful communication actually happening between, say, two people that share an otherwise 80-hour working week, but actually two people are sharing that. And there's kind of, whenever somebody has a phone call or whenever a document is updated or a task created, that's in a shared workspace. Technology can help with that as well. And so really actually embedding those practices so that jobs and hours can be shared in a way that doesn't impact kind of performance and doesn't impact the output. And I think it's also really useful, kind of, we've been talking about the impact of the gender pay gap and the dynamics that contribute to it on men as well as women. And I think there's a kind of really quite unsettling statistic here, is that, long working hours for men have been linked to increased stress, burnout, adverse health effects. And according to a study that was published in 2015, long working hours were associated with a 37% higher risk of coronary heart disease compared to standard working hours. And now let's take a step back and actually think about the impact of those health implications on the business, but also on the family unit and on an individual
and
well.
Also, again, on the wider society, right? What are the health costs and what are all of these economic burdens associated with these long working hours? And even if you think like, we have this working rule of, kind of 9 to 5, which is now kind of starting to be dismantled into more flexible ways of working, more flexible hours. And we are kind of moving towards this kind of hybrid way of working. But even if we think about the standard 9 to 5 working pattern, that in itself, when that has been introduced, that was a revolutionary idea, because what was before that? People were working 6 days a week, would have 1 day off on Sunday usually. So there were 6 working days for 16-hour long shifts, right? So this was like, initially there's all of this kind of like factory work and all of this kind of industrial practices. And a little bit before that was the reality. So I think sometimes we also take for granted that what we are now not happy with, like 9 to 5, right? That in itself, at some point, that was a huge shift. That was revolutionary. And we also need to rethink in the same way how we made that shift to fit better that type of the reality of this kind of industrial factory ways of working, where you now have evenings with your family, when you have weekends with your family. For those kind of jobs that were there and for those kind of lifestyles that people had in 50s, 60s, 70s, right, that was acceptable and that was a great thing to have. This model doesn't serve us anymore, and therefore we have to re-engineer back. How do we see human productivity? How do we see our work successful? We have all of these new technologies, AI, that can really take a lot of manual labor away from you and really automate and systemize a lot of work, which actually supposed to mean that we have more flexibility and more freedom and less human working hours in a way, but it's still not happening in reality, right? We're talking about this, we're talking about the AI completely, redesigning the way we live and the way we work. But obviously, how do we get there? There is still a lot of processes to navigate. And with like 4-day working week, for example, that's been really, really successful. It also has been, there's been one district in Cambridgeshire that they have tested that in their entire borough, and the results have been amazing. And unfortunately, government overruled that as a best practice to demonstrate and to pass on into any kind of recommendations in a way. So it is really interesting that, again, when we have our governance and our politics and the way they dictate our ways of working, that will again affect some of those values, beliefs, and what companies are allowed to do with their working hours. But yeah, I think, as private companies, we have so much freedom to redesign our cultures, our ways of working, and we should role model that. We should demonstrate what is right and what is good. And it all starts with first listening to your people and really understanding that the workforce that I have is a collection of human beings with their own specific needs. And if we design everything we do in that business with their needs in mind, we cannot go wrong.
Certainly, and because that's when we really get the best out of people, when we have their needs in mind. And even thinking from the business perspective here, I think we want to be examining what is motivating that fear, that resistance to change. And actually, when has resistance to change ever really been beneficial in business and in life? We actually want to adapt to change, and we want to adapt to those changing circumstances and really make the most of the kind of new technologies and practices that are kind of happening around us. I mean, when we think about long working hours, there's so much evidence to say that they're actually not efficient, and they actually end up costing businesses more. So there was a study in 2018 that showed, from Stanford University, showing that productivity declines significantly after 50 hours of work per week and dramatically drops again after 55 hours. And that is, that's simply the business case. It makes sense to have shorter working hours. It will involve changing internal practices and kind of the structure of roles and ways of working. But that change, the investment in that change, will be worthwhile. And as you say, Evelina, as private companies, there's a huge amount of flexibility in the way that we shape ourselves and our businesses, but also the way that we shape society. And I think it's generally companies that are ahead of the curve, ahead of the change, and lead in these practices that end up doing better in terms of reputation, but also business. So why? I would challenge kind of companies and organizations to really think about, what is the resistance here? Why that fear for changing practices? And what are you actually losing out on in the long term? Maybe kind of investing in making these changes early on, especially in smaller companies, where you're maybe still in kind of forming your working practices, or during periods of rapid growth and redevelopment. Actually, what can you be gaining in the long term by investing in more sustainable practices now?
Absolutely. And I think also sometimes leaders, owners, the board don't necessarily have the right data and statistics and numbers and figures to illustrate the ROI on these long-term initiatives, right? When you create more of the social equality, when you create more of this flexible working hours, it becomes much more difficult to then monitor the performance, right? And when you measure productivity, that is such a subjective measure in terms of, what is your business operations and what are your specific outputs when you're in your company, that could be used as that measure. And because there are such a huge differences in that, it makes it very difficult to kind of compare and share some of those best practices and to say, hey, we've done this initiative, and that's exactly what it either costed us, or this is exactly what was the result and the impact and the ROI on that. So with that in mind, we've been working recently on developing this kind of human capital index scale, where you look at how can we really map some of our human capital metrics to that continuum of human sustainability and the level of risk that we have associated with not supporting our people. So if you think on one hand of the extreme, you have, this phrase that we all hear very well of, people are our greatest assets, right? But for people to be your greatest assets, they're supposed to be building your sustainable long-term future of the organization. So your metrics have to demonstrate that the investment in people has much greater return on the long-term success on the business and shareholder returns and economic value of that organization. On the other hand, you have opposite scenario where actually humans are your liability. And this could be a result of health issues. It could be a result of long-term stress and sicknesses, but it's also comes with a lot of brand reputation. If you have high turnover, if you have very poor ratings of net promoter score, if you have your, 1-star reviews on Glassdoor, right? What does that do to your company? And also, let's not forget the biggest thing of these litigation cases where something goes wrong. And of course, now your company is liable for not doing the right thing for this person in that specific situation, and the implications of that. And of course, in the middle of that scale, you have this kind of like cost versus value, kind of tit for tat, like we're going to give you this pay, this is what you expect back from you, and this kind of more of this equal kind of scenario where humans are cost in a way, and you are just looking at how to get more out of them. So I think really we need to shift our thinking. If we're thinking about redesigning our workplaces and equality, we really need to look at identifying where we are in supporting those people's needs and whether people are really our assets, including women and mothers and fathers and people with a lot of diverse life needs, right? And knowing what exactly we need to do to get closer to that. And if you would like to explore how that can be done, we would be more than happy to introduce some of our models and help you to calculate some of your human capital index and the value that you have from investment in people, and in a way that uses this human-centric approach to really understand what your people really need and how can we build organizations that support that.
Absolutely. I think that's kind of a nice place to round off there, but really kind of welcome any questions as well about these sort of human capital metrics and our framework, and how we kind of look at human needs in that way, and how to create these plans for generating human sustainability as well as business sustainability. Would really love to hear your thoughts.
Wonderful. So thank you everyone for listening, and we'll see you the same time, same place next week, and have a wonderful day. Bye.